Yeah, we are live.
Good evening. I'm Kiran Keshavamurthy, and it gives me a great pleasure to invite you to today's session on behalf of the Anajuri team. Today we have with us Dr. Kaustav Bakhshi. Dr. Kaustav Bakhshi is Assistant Professor, Department of English, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. A Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow. His doctoral thesis, written with partial funding from the Trust, is entitled Family, Sexualities and Aging in Sri Lankan Expatriate Fiction, Kinship, Power Relations, and the State. A member of the editorial advisory board of Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, and an occasional contributor to In Plain Speak, the digital magazine of Tarshi, talking about reproductive and sexuality health in India. He usually writes on post-colonial literatures, queer cultures, and cinema in South Asia. He has presented papers on queer lives and cultures in several national and international conferences and institutes, such as Columbia University, University of London, University of Connecticut, Syracuse University, City University in New York, European conferences on South Asian studies, Paris, the IAAS, etc. He has published on queer identities and cultures in several international peer-reviewed journals, such as South Asian Review, Postcolonial Text, New Cinemas, Journal of Contemporary Film, South Asian History and Culture, and South Asian Popular Culture. His latest published books include Popular Cinema in Bengal, Stardom, Genre, Public Cultures, Routledge 2019, Queer Studies, Text, Context, Praxis, Orion Black Swan 2019, and Rituparna Ghosh, Cinema, Gender and Art, Routledge 2015. At Jadavpur University, Kaustav teaches courses related to gender and sexuality, apart from regular courses on English literature and culture. Gives me great pleasure to invite you again, Dr. Bakshi, and we all look forward to your talk. Over to you.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, Anna Chori, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure talking to all of you. I have never done this before, like in the sense that meeting you all and speaking to you. This is a great opportunity, I'm sure. Um, while I was discussing with Kiran that what we can possibly do for this session, I suggested that let's talk about the etymological evolution, the way the word queer has evolved over centuries, like from the 16th century to the present day, as the title of my talk says. Um, because it is very interesting to see the word which has now become like a buzzword within the LGBT community, and uh, it's so it is so loaded politically today, but it didn't really have that kind of a glamorous association if we go back in time. So I would like to talk about that because this is very interesting. This always fascinates me that in the English dictionary there is perhaps no other word which has undergone so many changes, as in to say that there are very few words which had so many negative associations to begin with. Very derogatory, very negative, and almost sordid. The word queer carried so much weight in the sense that uh, it meant anything which had to do with something negative. It never had any positive association. In fact, today when we say queer studies, it sounds as if like we have the word has been sort of apotheosized, so to speak. I'm sorry, I'm using kind of a theological allusion, but it is almost like that. Like when you kind of associate queer with theory, it is like bringing a slang. Queer is actually a slang. For the longest time, it was it was a slang. Like, and also when a slang becomes an academic word, it becomes a part of an academic discourse and also political discourse. It is fascinating that how a slang is reclaimed. So this whole business of political reclamation, which has happened, it is fascinating. I don't think I can think of any other word which has undergone such a huge transition like from a slang to a politically loaded word, which is kind of celebrated across the globe today. Perhaps the word disabled, very recently, the word disabled has been reclaimed by the disabled community in that way, almost following the trajectory of queer. But even the word disabled didn't have so many negative associations. And it is interesting to see how this word has evolved. And of course, it is not an English word to begin with. As you know that English as a language is composed of many, many loan words, very many loan words. It has taken like very, very generously it has borrowed from Western Europe and more from Germanic cultures. And the English culture does have that kind of a ancestry, if you know what I mean, from French, from Germany, from Irish, and from all the other colonies which the English conquered and ruled for so many years. So English language is formed with too many loan words, too many loan words. So the word queer is also a loan word. It is not very native to the English tongue. As far as I'm going to the first slide, so as far as history goes, recorded history goes, it is believed that the word originates in German. And as you can see on your screen, it was like Quer, and it had all these negative meanings associated with
Sir,
it.
we can't see your screen. I think you haven't shared yet.
Oh, okay. What do I do?
You need to share screen button.
Okay, just a second, just a second. Um, share screen. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, is it visible now? Okay,
Yes, sir.
great, great. So,
You can start the slideshow option. It would be better, sir.
all right, I will do that immediately. Just give me a second.
Yes, sir.
Better?
Yes, sir. It's fine.
Okay,
Thank you, sir.
okay, okay, great. So, as you can see that the German word Quer had these meanings like cross, wrong. Now, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word Quer was not so much in use before 1700, but it existed in the German vocabulary. Why does Oxford Dictionary says that it was not so much in use? Because we do not see the usage of the word so much in published literature in German before 1700. Okay, but the word existed, Quer. But very interestingly, we also see simultaneously the existence of the word Quar in Old and Middle Irish. Okay, so Old and Middle Ages, Cuar existed in Irish. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing it right, but I believe I am, because all these words had a phonetic similarity. Okay, so if you see your screen, it says that it meant curved, bent, or crooked, but I would say that here curved, bent, or crooked had a lot to do with structures. You know, the word Cuar was used for structures, bent structures, curved structures, or crooked structures. But in early modern Irish, now when I say early modern, I mean it is the time of the late 15th century, the early 16th century. That's early modern. Early modern, as you know, coincides with the English Renaissance or even the European Renaissance. It coincides with that. So early modern, so during the 14th century and the 15th century, queer became queer, Quaire. And now the change that we see, the meanings you see are almost the same as you can see on your screen. But remember here, the difference was that it started gathering a moral negativity. Why a moral negativity? Like crookedness, and having a twisted spine. Now, having a twisted spine was referred to those who had a hunchback. Okay, hunchback people. But also having a twisted spine had a metaphorical meaning in the sense that somebody who was not really upright. Now, very interestingly, look at the words oblique, curved, bent, crooked, twisted. All of these, if you can note, is all the antonyms, the opposites of the word straight, right? Opposite of the word straight. Crooked, opposite of straight. Twisted, opposite of straight. Oblique, opposite of straight. But remember the word straight as we understand it today, straight as in heterosexual, the usage of that word was not really known at that time. Not known. In fact, straight as a slang referring to heterosexual people emerged much later. But interestingly, its opposite, queer, already carried all the antonyms of straight. Now you know why heterosexual people are called straight, because it is an antonym of everything which is curved, bent, crooked, not straight, not upright. I hope I'm making sense here. So in early modern Irish usage, the words began acquiring a kind of a moral negative sense. Okay. Now, almost simultaneously or little later, we see the emergence of the word queer, Q-U-A-I-R, queer, in Hiberno English. Now, what is Hiberno English? Hiberno English is a nativized form of English, which was used by Irish people, particularly in Northern Ireland and also the Republic of Ireland. I mean, both places. So it is in Hiberno English, which is a dialect. It's a nativized English dialect used by the Irish. We see the emergence of the word queer. Now, you see here, it has gained even more negative meanings. Questionable, suspicious, dubious, like somebody you cannot trust. So as if oblique, perverse, crooked was not enough, now we had questionable, suspicious, dubious. So negative meanings were constantly piled onto that word. So remember, we are still in the early modern era, right? We are still in the early modern era, and therefore the word queer has not yet arrived. We still have Q-U-A-I-R, queer. This word has not yet gained the connotation of the sexual other. It has not yet gained because we still do not have a sexuality discourse yet. We will arrive at that much later on. In fact, queer will gain a sexual currency not before the 18th century or the 19th century, but the word will continue to gain, horrible meanings. We will see how it happens, and it's fascinating how it does. I'm moving on to the next screen and just more theories, like while the word Q-U-A-I-R, queer, was in usage in Hiberno English, that is in Ireland, at the same time, almost in the early 16th century, as you can see, the date has been given, almost at the same time, we also see the usage in Scottish Gaelic. So Scottish Gaelic. So Gaelic is a Scottish dialect in which perhaps Wordsworth's Solitary Reaper was perhaps singing. So there we see the word Q-U-E-I-R. Q-U-E-I-R, which is also spelled as Q-U-E-Y-R as well. So queer and queer, these two words, one taken from Hiberno English, and the other from the Scottish Gaelic, these two words are in vogue. The first recorded usage of queer is found in Dunbar's Flyting Poem, which was addressed to Kennedy. Now, what is a flyting poem? Flyting poem is a poem which is full of abuses. When you are like have a rival poet or somebody who's a rival, so what you can do is You can right. Your rivalry can be expressed through poems, and it can be full of abuses and full of derogatory terms and all of that. So a flighting poem called, in that flighting poem, Dunbar called his rival Kennedy queer, not in the sense of a sexual other, but in the sense of someone who cannot be trusted, someone who is possibly crooked, somebody who is terribly dubious, any of that. So in so let's see, German, Old and Middle Irish, Early Modern Irish, Hiberno English, Scottish Gaelic, in all of these lexicons, queer had a very, very derogatory associations, very derogatory associations. Now, if you see that there is a dominant theory that holds that queer is perhaps the descendant of, as I've mentioned on the screen, it's a Proto-Indo-European morpheme, twerk, which means to twist, turn, wind, or cut. Now, morpheme is actually an elementary word which cannot be broken further down. Okay, so twerk is a kind of a root word from which queer has possibly emerged. Okay. Now, the point is that twist, turn, wind, or cut, whatever it is, all of these root meanings became very, very prominent and apparent in the various manifestations of queer which we see even before we arrive in the early modern English. All right. I hope I do not have to repeat this. I've made sense so far. So we see the word changing, it's not yet changing its meaning, rather acquiring more and more negative meanings as we move from one linguistic culture to the other. But all of them are kind of associated. All of them are sort of synonyms of each other. Now, how does queer enter the English lexicon? In all probabilities, because it was available in Scottish Gaelic sources, Scotland, there is a possibility that it had entered through land. Okay, Scotland, England, it entered through land. The word has traveled across land. But the dominant theory is, and I'm moving on to the next slide, it says that the speculation is that the word actually entered colloquial English through Irish sailors. Okay. Now, Irish sailors, they used to use this word very often, queer fella. You see on the right of the screen, queer fella, who was any merchant seaman who does not conform to the average type, who is a nautical eccentric. Now, what is a nautical eccentric? Somebody with maybe a little insane, someone who may not be, quite easy to deal with, someone who had a number of idiosyncrasies, all of that. So queer fella was something which Irish shipmen used a lot. All right. So that is a speculation. That's what linguists actually speculate. That may not be through the Scottish dialect, all directly through through the loaning of German words. But most probably the word entered English because Irish sailors used to use this word very often to anybody who never conformed to their own, to the standards of quote unquote normalcy. Quote unquote normalcy. Now, so it enters English language from whichever means it may be, like through Scottish Gaelic users or Irish sailors as users. We don't know, but most probably this is the dominant speculation that Irish sailors are the ones who brought the word into the English colloquial usage. Now, colloquial usage is important because, as I told you, queer remained a slang. Queer was never a very formal word. It was not so much used in polite conversations. All right. So queer was a slang. Any of those abuses, any of those slangs that you use. So queer was not so much used when you are maybe in a formal conversation or having a polite conversation in your living room. You would possibly not use queer. Now, QUAIR, the Hiberno English form, which was also used by the Irish sailors, underwent a significant phonetic and visual transition, as you can see, through the great vowel shift in the English Renaissance, which happened in the English Renaissance. Now, let me tell you what is vowel shift, through which QUAIR, queer, becomes QUEER. See the change of spelling. QUAIR changes to QUEER. Okay. How does that happen? What is the great vowel shift? Now, if you are students of English literature, this will be easier for you to understand, but let me just explain the vowel shift, not like I'll not go into the nuances of the changes in diphthongs or the mergers or shortening of vowels, but I will give you a larger working idea. Like if you look at the works of Geoffrey Chaucer, one of the iconic authors of the Middle English period, the language in which Chaucer writes, and the language in which Shakespeare writes. Shakespeare is an early modern writer, a Renaissance writer. So the shift from Chaucer to Shakespeare will tell you that it will show very clearly that Chaucer's English is nothing like Shakespeare's. In fact, today, if you want to read Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales in the original, it might have to be translated for you. It is a completely different English. It is not the kind of English which we know today. But by the time Shakespeare began writing, Shakespeare's English is much more familiar to us, much more recognizable to us, and it has approximated to what we call modern English nowadays. But even Shakespeare and his contemporaries, whether it is Ben Jonson, whether the metaphysical poets, whether it's Francis Bacon, whoever you are reading, everybody is writing in that same language. And John Lyly, for example. So all of them were writing in a language which is still not the standard English or the modern English that we know today. So gradually, the vowel shift happened with the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, and the vowel shift happened because English language, because it was formed of so many loan words from various languages, it had to be standardized. So they began standardizing the English language based on the pronunciation of words, whereby vowels were enlarged or vowels were shortened, and the vowel shift, which began in the late 14th century, continued, uninterrupted till the 17th century and thereafter. But till the 17th century or the beginning, late 17th century, early 18th century, we had what is known as Standard English. Now, one of the most iconic English poets like Alexander Pope, who writes in the 18th century, who is a post-industrial revolution poet, if you look at his works, his English is again not so much like Shakespeare's, but it is much more like what we understand English to be today. It is closer to the more standardized English that today we have. That means by the 18th century, the vowel shift was complete. All right. So the vowel shift was complete. It was a continuous process. The vowel shift continued after that, but not so much. So by the 18th century, and by the way, please let me also point this out, that the vowel shift began actually more in southern England, and then it traveled to northern England. Okay. So you will see that, for example, and while English was being standardized, let me just point this out to you. Several other English dialects also existed simultaneously. We had a formal English and many other forms of informal English traveling around. A very good example will be if you are reading Wuthering Heights, you will see that, the servants are speaking in a dialect which the masters aren't. So there is a very clear hierarchy in language which occurs, and the more formalized English which emerges through the vowel shift is used more by the upper classes, and the lower classes continues with that older form of English mostly, but if not the written form. The written form is the one which is spoken more by the upper classes. So for the written standardized form, this vowel shift happened over so many centuries. And during this vowel shift, Q-U-A-I-R, queer, becomes Q-W-E-E-R. In all probabilities, according to the Oxford Dictionary, I believe it happens in the late 16th century. In the 1580s or 1570s, around that time. There is no clear date here. It's difficult, it's difficult to actually, pinpoint one particular date. You can't. But the general speculation again is that Q-U-A-I-R, queer, became Q-U-E-E-R, queer, because of the great vowel shift, and that happened during the Renaissance. I hope I made some sense out there. But let me tell you that what are the meanings which the English Q-U-E-E-R, queer, gained as soon as it entered the English vocabulary. But please remember, Q-U-E-E-R, queer, although it was standardized by the vowel shift, it still remained a slang. Okay, it was not kind of formalized into polite speech. It was not. So let's move to the next slide. And by 1567, as my slide says, that the English adjective queer has gained these horrible meanings: bad, contemptible, worthless, untrustworthy, disreputable. Not very different from what the meanings the ancestors of this word carried. So it was horrible. So the legacy continued. And by 1781, which is the late 18th century, the adjective queer now became a verb. It's very interesting, queer as a word has functioned as an adjective, as a verb, as well as a noun. I'll show you how it also functioned as a noun later on. So it has also undergone, through this vowel shift, it has also undergone changes as far as the idea of the parts of speech is concerned. So queer is a very flexible word that way. And as we know that within English usages, we do use adjectives and nouns as verbs. And it's quite cool if you do that, like watering your plants. What is watering? Giving water to your plants doesn't sound cool. You say watering your plants. So the noun becomes a kind of a verb that way. That is in the participle form or whatever form. So the adjective queer becomes a verb by 1781. But you see, when it becomes a verb also, it gains such negative connotations. It says spoil or ruin. It was so far worthless, untrustworthy, disreputable in an adjectival form. When it becomes a verb, it is to spoil or ruin. So the basic meaning remains unaltered as a verb as well as an adjective. So no, not much change. And we have come to the late 18th century already. But please note, we still do not see a very clear sexual association with the word queer. And the word straight is nowhere. No, that is to say, the word straight is there in the English dictionary. Of course, it's there, but it has also not gained the meaning as heteronormative or heterosexual. That meaning is still not attributed to straight. So queer is doing its rounds and doing these very awful rounds of gaining more and more, contemptible words, contemptible associations. Almost the queer was sort of like a magnet. It was attracting all kind of, bad word infections, if I can put it that way. So moving on to the next slide, and this is very interesting. While in the English language, the word queer was, gaining all these negative connotations, there's so many idioms, So queer started to be used in many idioms, and as I've written on my slide, that whether you went to a liquor shop or whether you went to the army or whether you were talking to a seaman, queer always had a negative connotation. Do you see the list of idioms I have cataloged here? One is bullet queer, nervous under fire. Now, bullet queer is a very was very frequently used in the army when somebody showed extreme phobia for facing the bullet. Everybody is of course scared of the bullet, but By calling somebody bullet queer, you almost challenge that person's masculinity. Now, this is important. Bullet queer. This word is this phrase is important to me. That it brought, even in the case of queer fella, which the Irish seamen used, then eccentric seaman who cannot be at home on the seas, that was also challenging his masculinity, but not so overtly as bullet queer does. If you are nervous under fire, then of course you're not man enough. That is the meaning. So a very slight kind of a gendered association begins to form with the emergence of bullet queer. And all of this is happening through I have not given you the dates here, but through the 17th and the 18th century. Okay. To queer someone's pitch, which means to ruin and spoil and to undermine one's efforts, plans, ideas, whatever. Now, even today, we use the phrase queering someone's speech. We do that. If you are, too anglicized, and if you are, using English idioms, queering someone's speech is not something which is uncommon. It is quite common even today. Like queer as a $3 bill, this became very famous in the US in the 18th and the 19th century, 19th century mostly. Why queer as a $3 bill is such a famous idiom in New York, across the US, I'm sorry, not so much just not in New York, everywhere. It means completely or obviously fake or false. Why? Because, for example, in India, we never had a 3 rupee note. We never have a 7 rupee note, right? Similarly, in the US, they never had a $3 note. No $3 note ever existed in the US. So when you say queer as a $3 bill, you mean you're talking about something fake, something false, something not true, something completely counterfeit, inauthentic. So that also became a part of kind of an everyday idiomatic usage. Queer in the attic. This is interesting. Mentally impaired, either due to stupidity or intoxication. Now, if you look at the list of idioms I have catalogued, you see that, don't you see that the word has bloated up in its negativities? Totally illicit, fake, counterfeit, mentally impaired, intoxicated, nervous, you name it. How much more negative can a word become? Why is stressing of this large, number of negative synonyms important? It is important because you would understand that why queer had to be reclaimed in the late 20th century, that is in 1990, 1991, and the political struggle which was associated with it, because the word was already in the public consciousness as something which was so derogatory, which was so particularly a slang and whatever. But it was very, very difficult to reclaim the term. So that's why I'm giving you this history, just to make you understand that how loaded the word had become by 1990 when the reclamation happens. Moving on to the next slide, when did queer become homosexual? In my understanding, queer was already homosexual by the 17th century, at least, when we had the Molly houses. If you are aware of queer subcultures in Britain, you would know that Molly houses were very popular as haunts of homosexual men mostly, who gathered for a drink and they associated with each other, they hooked up, they met each other. So the Molly houses were very famous in the 17th century, in the 18th century. Yes, 17th century too, by the late 18th century, by the late 17th century, after Charles II came to the throne, that is after English Restoration happens. But by the 18th century, Molly houses were more famous. Maybe, as I said, that in the, there is no recorded evidence of this, but yeah, the word was in vogue, was in circulation as a slang amongst people from within the community. There was no community as such as we understand community today, but there was an understood community. So within that understood community, and of course, you used queer to designate them as different sexually. But the first written, in a written way. That's how the Oxford English Dictionary kind of records this, that the first written evidence of the term queer, as you can see on your screen, is found in a letter written by in one of John Douglas's infamous letters. Now, John Douglas, I'm sure the 9th Marquess of Queensberry is very nice. It's a villain in our queer history nowadays. Why? Because he outed Oscar Wilde. Interestingly, John Douglas's sons, Drumlanrig and Lord Alfred Douglas, both of them were queer. And the father has been, going around accusing other men for corrupting both his sons. So the first one, the first letter he wrote for the Archibald Primrose, please search him later. He was the 5th Earl of Rosebery. He also became Prime Minister of Britain for a very brief period of time. You can see the dates, March 1894 to 1895. And his elder son, Drumlanrig, was his secretary. And so John Douglas found out that he was in a homosexual relationship with the Prime Minister. So he said that my son is being corrupted. But remember, so in 1894, this letter, the first recorded written form of queer as referring to homosexuals. Now, this Marquess of Queensberry, as I just said, also outed Oscar Wilde. So John Douglas is one of those who is now known to be using the word queer quite officially. From a slang, therefore, it now entered a kind of, or you can say, a more formal zone. But when he was using queer, he was doing it with the intention of vilifying the person who was being identified as involving in quote-unquote sodomy. Okay, so although it was a bit formalized as it was written in a letter, but also it carried the implication of the slang already. Okay, it actually carried the implication because he had to shame the person. It's like shaming. Queer now becomes a word for shaming. For you are shaming Oscar Wilde, you are shaming Archibald Primrose. So queer was used to as a derogatory term, somebody who did not fit, somebody was. So now you see how shaming is being associated. In fact, in the phrase bullet queer, the idea of shaming was already there. Okay, even in queer fella used by the Irish seamen, the idea of shaming was there, but it was not so apparent, not so pronounced as it was in John Douglas's usage in a formal letter. Right? Look at the date 1894. Almost 30 years since the term homosexual had been already coined. The term homosexual was coined in the 1860s, but even in 1894, John Douglas is still using the word queer. My speculation is that he did not want to use the word homosexual, which appeared to be a little more scientific, a little more medicalized. So queer still carried the word, punch of a negative slang, which homosexual perhaps did not, because it was it emerged within the realm of psychiatry. So maybe it was a little more respectable term compared to queer. So maybe he was not using homosexual because of that. Also, in all probabilities, homosexual in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, it was much more in vogue. It was much more used in scientific discourses, not so much in everyday speech. So maybe that could be a reason. I don't know, but I believe that homosexual still appeared to be a more respectful word than queer. So he was using queer just to intensify the shaming. Now, so the coinage of the terms homosexuality and its binary opposite, which is heterosexual, of course, and you see that it was already there by 1869. Two terms, homosexual and heterosexual. Karl Maria Kurt Benny, Austrian, Hungarian. He was a traveler, a psychiatrist, everything, a lot of things. So this person invented the term homosexual and its binary opposite heterosexual, and immediately what happened, it was not there so far, that we had a power hierarchy. Power hierarchy as in whoever was queer, whoever was homosexual was of course less powerful compared to someone who was designated as heterosexual. So the invention of the term homosexual and heterosexual in 1869 generated a power structure, a power hierarchy, which was not so much there. And homosexuals were immediately labeled as not normal in vis-a-vis or judged against the standards of heterosexuality, which was the normalized version of sexual expression, right? So heterosexuality was immediately equated with the normal sexual expression, and homosexuality was certainly a digressive one, a deviant one, but deviancy and digression, all of that was fine, but it was also associated with something which was not normal. And Foucault's famous declaration, which I've put on the screen, the sodomite has been a temporary aberration, the homosexual was now a species. Well, yeah, Foucault says that much later in History of Sexuality in 1975, 76, around that time. But of course, more this aphorism today is so important that so far, queer was still an aberration. I would replace sodomite by queer. It was still an aberration, but now homosexual emerges as a species who has been scientifically declared as not normal, and it also carries all those negative associations which we're talking about so far. So the late 19th century is very important in order to understand the emergence of the sexuality identity discourse. Within what Foucault says scientia sexualis, this whole discourse of scientia sexualis, within that we have this new word homosexual, its binary opposite heterosexual, and a whole range of discourses, literatures emerge at that time. Also around this, the same time, we see the emergence of the discipline which we call sexology, and also anthropology. And sexology and anthropology, in a way, were kind of, colluding together in a certain way to kind of, project homosexuality as something which was not normal. Okay, something which is not normal. Although late 19th century and early 20th century anthropological studies would reveal to you that many anthropologists were discovering cultures in the New World, that is, in the non-European countries, where they have found the existence of homosexuality to be as normal as heterosexuality was imagined to be within the British cultures. All right? But the point is that I believe it just went on a little too far here, where one of the reasons, for colonizing the non-European countries, like, oh, even homosexuality exists there, so they may be, it's a horrible thing. So, if you are colonizing some people who are not yet civilized enough, one of the reasons could be, oh, we found homosexuality in their culture. You see what I mean? But a very positive way in which this anthropological, sexological work we see in the works of Edward Carpenter. Of course, Edward Carpenter was doing it in a very positive way, but I don't have the time to discuss Edward Carpenter here. But I'm just giving you an idea of how queer was becoming a synonym of homosexuality in the 19th century, and how it is also generating a whole literary, philosophical, scientific, anthropological, sexological discourse. So it was becoming huge. It was becoming a very, very expansive term. All of that happened in the 19th century. And as you know, this is also the time, as we all know, at this moment also, the sodomy laws, the anti-sodomy laws began to be introduced in the colonies. Now you can make 2 and 2 4 here, that why these anti-sodomy laws now suddenly became, necessary in the colonies. because there was a kind of an academic discovery of homosexuality on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, that is a very common theory. Everybody knows this, that many British, I'm sticking to Britain, I'm not getting into Europe. So, I mean, yeah, of course, Europeans too. Why not? Western Europeans, many of them who had these colonies, many of them were pursuing a queer life in the colonies, and all of that had to be stopped, and a law had to be introduced. So what we call the draconian colonial law, which turned into Section 377 of the IPC, came into India during the 19th century. I believe now you can make the connection what was happening in Britain, that we needed that kind of a law in the colonies as well. Right? So I would not divert or digress more. I'm just, getting carried away if I'm saying all of that. I will not. Let me come back to the queer, discourse once more. So queer equal to homosexual usage as colloquial noun and adjective in the early 20th century. Remember, I told you that queer, which entered the English lexicon as an adjective, turned into a verb in the 18th century. Now, by the 20th century, queer is a noun. How is queer a noun? We use it as a noun nowadays. We don't. Are you queer? Are we queer? We ask this question, don't we? Are we queer? Are you queer? So when you ask somebody, are you queer? You are using it in a nominal form. That is the noun form. So he is a queer person. You are using it in adjective form. Has he been queered by your influence? You are using it as a verb. So now queer has all of these variations. Now, you see, you look at my slide, you will see that the Oxford English Dictionary in 1914, it records a 1914 edition of the Los Angeles Times in which a particular club is described as queer. People have a good time, identifying it as the first media articulation of the term, designating people with non-normative sexual choices. So Oxford English Dictionary, I have not done this. Oxford English Dictionary identifies this publication in the Los Angeles Times as the first print media articulation of the term queer. But let me tell you, the next point, bullet point, mentions Christopher Isherwood. But let me tell you that throughout the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, you had the emergence of many what we call the left-wing poets, one of them being W.H. Auden. W.H. Auden in England and in America was very, well known as a queer poet. Auden never came out publicly, but his group, I mean, if you are interested, you can later check one of my articles on this very interesting friendship which Auden had with Christopher Isherwood, Stephen Spender, and all of them, and how they had an alternative homosexual life in Europe, mostly in Germany. So Auden was quite well known as a queer poet, and he used to visit one of those clubs. So what we have in metropolitan centers today, in Kolkata, in Bangalore, in Delhi, in Bombay, we have these Itisu clubs that we have, these parties which are organized nowadays. So this club culture was very much a part of the homosexual subculture for a very, very long time, going back to the Molly houses of the 18th century. W.H. Auden, 1914 edition of the Los Angeles Times, which carried the word queer in a more formalized way. Now, Christopher Isherwood wrote in his novel Goodbye to Berlin in 1939, "Men dressed as women, do you mean they are queer?" The way he uses it, he's writing from Germany, remember this, way he's using it, it shows that the word has become very popular in German and also in the English language. And it means men dressed as women, men not conforming. Now, aren't you wondering that why aren't women referred to as queer so much? You will see that seamen, army men. I'm constantly referring to men, 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 and even men dressed as women as queer. Why don't we have so many women, references to women? Mostly because, that is the same reason why the colonial law doesn't mention lesbianism. It's because, in a way, of course, there are other reasons. We can get into the philosophical details of that in some other session, why it doesn't have lesbianism in it. But one reason was being that women were not so much in the public domain, not so much in the public eye. So homosexuality between women is something from which men used to, love to run away as much as they wanted to, because, it also meant a complete rejection of patriarchy. So I believe men for a longest period of time were afraid to even acknowledge lesbianism. They were afraid to, I believe so. They were afraid to acknowledge lesbianism. It would be like, challenging their own masculinity. So maybe we don't see so many of women being referred to as queer till about the early 20th century, but of course, lesbian women too came to be known as queer later on. So I believe I have been able to give you a trajectory of how the word queer has evolved over a period of time and how it has got into a political discourse, how it has entered a more formalized zone of expression, from a slang to a more formalized usages. But then when was the reclamation? Why do you use queer without, feeling, why are we so proud of the word queer today? Incidentally, it happened within a Pride March in New York City, and I'm going to move on to that now. Before that, let me talk about the word straight a little bit. The term straight originated as a mid-20th century gay slang term for heterosexuals. Now, remember, the word straight was already there. But if you remember my earlier slides, I was constantly telling you the word queer had in it all the antonyms of straight already. So the best word one could think of within the dictionary of slangs was straight for the heterosexuals. It was not very difficult, straight, because queer was crooked, queer was twisted, queer was something which was bent. So why not straight? Right? So, but we see the use in a more formalized way, as I have mentioned it on the slide. It's in a Sex Variants. It's a book which was written in 1941 by G.W. Henry. And I've also given you the volume and the page number if you want to check, 1176, page number 2, Sex Variants, volume 2. And in this book, G.W. Henry brings straight into a more formalized usage. So now, we already had the heterosexual, homosexual binary, where heterosexual was much more powerful than homosexual in terms of its perceived normalcy, quote unquote. Now we have a new binary, straight/queer, 1941. Now, don't take 1941 as the date on which suddenly people become aware of the word queer. No. That doesn't happen overnight. Like one fine morning, you don't just get up and say, okay, heterosexuals will be known as queer today. No. The word straight was certainly in circulation, but as I said, that it was kind of recorded. It was kind of recorded in 1941. So before it is recorded in writing, it's very difficult for dictionaries, to trace back and, include it. So it's not that it just happened like that. Okay. Now let's continue. Let's come to New York City. Queers read this, political reclamation in New York City in 1990. What was this leaflet all about? This leaflet, Queers read this, distributed at the New York Pride March in June 1990, you can see my slide, was one of the earliest and the most sulfurous proclamations. I call it sulfurous because nothing less than sulfurous can actually, describe it. In fact, sulfurous is not even kind of an English, it's not used very formally within the English language. Sulfurous proclamations of queerness, which recuperated almost kind of emptying queer of all of its negativities, evacuating out of it all the negativities from the swamp of negative associations. And look at the line, you as an alive and functioning queer are a revolutionary. Queer who was bent, who was crooked, who was not straight, who was disreputable, who was condemnable, who was counterfeit, now became a revolutionary. Why have I used that link under the on the slide? This link will take you to the pamphlet Queers Read This. This pamphlet is now available online. You can read the entire pamphlet, and anybody who is interested in queer studies must read this pamphlet. Because this pamphlet was actually setting the ground for queer revolution, which began in the 1991. The kind of radicalism we see in this pamphlet was not available before this. I'm not suggesting there was no queer revolution before this. Of course there was. I mean, all through the 70s, all through the 80s, we had huge queer revolutions. The Stonewall riot had taken place in 1969. But the way Queers Read This mobilized queer people, no other political pamphlet could do it before. This is the moment of political reclamation when a term with so many negative associations is adapted. It is adapted as a term which now means revolutionary. Why is it revolutionary? What does Queers Read This demanded of queer people? It told queer people that, listen, you can't use the word gay for yourself anymore. If I have time, I will do, if ever again, I will do the etymology of gay someday, but not today. Don't call yourself gay. Why? Because within the English dictionary, as we know, gay means happy, cheerful. Okay. So he said that, well, we are not so happy, not so cheerful. We have a life of struggle. We have a life in which we are minoritized every day. We are marginalized every day. We are oppressed every day. Let's not call ourselves gay anymore. We are queer. We will be queer because let us reclaim, let us recuperate the term queer in such a manner so that something which was looked upon as disreputable, contemptible, something which was could not be spoken of in polite conversations, let's reclaim it as our own term. Let's reclaim it as our own term. It is very, very important we did that. And Queers Read This also made a claim that as a homosexual individual, it is not advisable for you to stay within the closet. Come out, populate the streets, make your presence felt. Because if you do not make your presence felt, then you can never, ever gain or ask for your legal rights. You know, in India, as all of you know, that in in the 2013 Supreme Court judgment, the most horrendous judgment ever, in that verdict, we had that the LGBT community is a minuscule minority. There was a problem of visibility, I'm sure, or the Supreme Court was not too, I'm not sure, maybe they were not too well informed when they used that term, minuscule minority. Yeah, in a population of 1.3 billions, I don't know, they could be a minuscule minority numerically, but no, they are not. Come on. And if you are identified as a minuscule minority when you are asking for rights, it's a very small section of society. So the Supreme Court of India, as it did, they said there's such a small community. Why do they need any kind of legal rights? Why homosexuality needs to be decriminalized? So taking over the streets, coming out of the closet, therefore becomes important. But please, you know, do not assume that I am urging you to come out. Of course, we can't do that. That's people's choice. And if they want to come out, they can come out whenever they want to. There's no pressure from anyone. But that's what Queers Read This actually meant, because it is a political necessity. That more faces out there, more numbers out there. And as you know, in a democracy, numbers always work, right? In a republic, in a democracy, numbers always work. So more people out there, more people like me, like you. So the us, the queer us needed to be expanded. So that's what Queers Read This was saying. And therefore, the term queer was thereby totally, you know, it gained that kind of political currency from this moment. 1990 June. And what happened in 1991 February, we had the emergence of queer theory. Queer equal to non-normative, but I'll come to queer theory a little later. I am not going to explain this to you, I've already did. Just go through the slide, which says that 1990 is a turning point in the etymological history of the term queer, a moment of rebirth, as it were, when the term was imbued with a spirit of rebellion, dissent, and radicalism. Every time you are using the word queer, every time you're saying, I am queer, you are a rebellious person. You are a radical person. You are voicing your dissent against heteronormativity. And the etymological journey of queer since then has been an extremely intriguing one. It went on to become the most contentious term within sexuality identity discourses. And I like this quote, defined more by what it is not than what it is for. I will stop here a bit and just, it is not digressive, but it's important. Queer is also a necessary term to dismantle an identity-based politics. That is to say, these categories, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual, no matter how many acronyms, how many more categories you include in this never-ending list of acronyms, the term queer is like a cloud term. It's kind of an umbrella term, which I would say is a very open term also. Open term in the sense that queer can mean anything. Queer can refer to the whole spectrum of sexuality, which is so wide, which is so large, that it is very difficult to even understand what sexuality entails, right? If you look at the works of Foucault, Judith Butler, Eve Sedgwick, Judith Halberstam, Gail Rubin, and Jacques Lacan, you will see that the human mind and the range of desires the human mind has is so wide, it's so interminable, that it's very difficult to have one single term for every desire. Gay doesn't always define the desire for my desire for another man. It can be different, there's something different, something between the interstices of gay and bisexual. How would you refer to that? There are various forms of desires, various forms of expression of desire. There are various forms in which desire is also enacted sexually, So queer is more of a umbrella term. Queer brings within it all the possibilities of sexual deviancy, all the possibility of this whole range of desires which cannot be marked, which cannot be pigeonholed, which cannot be categorized. So queer is given you a non-category. Queer is not a category, queer is a non-category. Queer is a non-category because it totally dismantles the idea of an identity-based politics. That is to say, just to simplify this a little more, if someone identifies as lesbian and has a kind of desire, which her friend, who is also a lesbian, they might have a discussion and saying, oh, you don't feel this way, I don't feel this way, so am I not a lesbian? You may not be you may be a lesbian, but you are more queer than that. It's easier to use queer. A gay person like XYZ, all three of them may identify as gay, but all three of them may not be feeling the desires for another man the same way. There cannot be similarity. So how do you address those differences which cannot be named? It is easier to name them as queer. So queer for me is a non-category. It totally, deconstructs the identity-based politics, which was predominant in the 70s and the 80s, particularly in the United States. So queer is a very useful term that way. And we have not been able to translate the term so far in the local languages. I don't know whether we can think of another term, because if we translate queer, in Bangla or in Ohomia, or in Malayalam, in Tamil, and if we have in our mind the history of queer from the English dictionary, we would end up, coming up with a word which may not fit us at all. So I don't know whether translation of queer is possible. So the untranslatability of the word queer also is very important here. It is therefore a political term which can be used in any culture, within any language, and it is a non-category. It is a non-category, and the queers read this. That pamphlet was kind of, extricating queer from a very, I could say, a linear understanding of sexuality to a more post-structuralist understanding of sexuality, where you could not really associate an identity with a desire like it was an equation. It was not so easy. So queer, I would say, the inaugural term for sexuality identity politics within the post-structuralist discourse. if I can put it that way. We can discuss that for for hours, like what is the post-structuralist discourse of sexuality. I can't get into that, but remember, this was kind of inaugurated by Foucault and, brought to a kind of a, you can say, a climax by Judith Butler. It's still been debated. So the next slide, the birth of queer theory. So as soon as the term queer was reclaimed, queer theory as a discipline, as a tool of critical analysis and political thinking, very important, entered the field of humanities and social sciences following a conference which was organized by Teresa de Lauretis. Teresa de Lauretis is our, star, the icon of queer studies today. She inaugurated it where? In the University of California, Santa Cruz in February 1990. But also at the same time, though Lauretis edited a special issue of Differences in 1991. Now, I told you that the term queer was reclaimed in June 1990, but this conference was already held in the University of California in February 1990. Now, please remember this, just going back to the word straight once more. So the word queer being retrieved or kind of reclaimed within the academia, so was very, very important because it's not about, the word not being recorded. So the word queer was recorded as a part of academic discourse by February 1990, in a more political discourse by June 1990. And in 1991, the summer of 1991, we had a special issue of Differences. Queer Theory, Lesbian and Gay Sexualities was the title. And this is the moment when queer theory entered the academia. The problem is that from here, queer started to gain so much political, social, cultural, and academic currency that now it has gone completely out of hand. Some people are using it as a positive term, some use it as a negative term, but whatever it is, queer still retains in it the idea of revolution, the idea of not conforming, the idea of challenging the norms, the idea of, thinking outside the box of sexual identities, and also the idea of normal sexualities. There is nothing called normal sexualities anymore. And if you see anybody using that term, you should call that person out. There is nothing normal. It's better that we, and also all through the 90s, from 1991 till today, 2020, for the last so many years, 30 years or so, we had another trajectory which queer completely took. But that is not something which we need to discuss here, because we know the trajectory more or less. It has become a part of political organizing across the globe. It has become titles of books all over the world. My latest book, Queer Theory, Queer Studies, Text, Context, Praxis, also had it as a part of the title. So, and also academic courses are named after it nowadays. But I'll end with this, that Teresa de Lauretis in 1990 only, in 1991, not so much in 1990, she speculated, and she said that I'm afraid that the more the term queer becomes popular, the more it is included or integrated within an academic discourse, the possibility of normativizing queer increases. And she was so right. So many students come to me, say, sir, I want to work on queer stuff, queer texts. So the moment the university curriculum is kind of integrating queer, it is in a way institutionalizing it. And any form of institutionalization, means that you are dethroning queer from that very revolutionary non-normative way of dealing with it. At Jadavpur University, we do stuff at times to keep the original meaning of queer alive by, for example, extending our queer studies class into a celebration of Section 377 of the IPC, where we danced to Umrao Jan songs. Men dancing to Umrao Jan songs, and we were kind of expanding the classroom into that space. We were criticized for that, very criticized. Why? What the hell are you doing? Like dancing to Umrao Jan songs? But I thought that that was important. Like when you are doing queer studies and you have already institutionalized it, you can also de-institutionalize it by performing as as somebody just said, yeah, we were performing the queer in a certain way by dancing to Belgian songs. We were doing a very bad job of it, but we certainly were doing it. I believe the session went on for a very long time. I could, the post-queer, as we call it today, I would ask you to go through one of Judith Butler's very interesting articles, which is called Critically Queer. Critically Queer came out in the GLQ Journal, 1993, if I'm not mistaken, 1993. Read that article. It will also give you an idea of what trajectory queer was going to take. Of course, we didn't get the time to talk about South Asia, India, how the term queer arrived here and how it was adapted within a political discourse. It arrived mostly through, American magazines and all, but also it became a part of queer organizing. So with that, I am happy to say thank you. And if you have any questions for me, you're most welcome to ask.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kaustav, for that extremely illuminating talk. Very meticulous and very well organized. Thank you very much. Let me just start the discussion. I mean, there are already quite a few questions from the audience, but I'll just exercise my prerogative as the host to ask you a few questions. Now, there are kind of a mixture of questions and comments. You were actually talking about, the early history of the term queer and the way it kind of connoted all these things, these negative qualities of someone who was untrustworthy, somebody who was suspicious, somebody who was crooked. And I was also reminded of how it might also signify somebody who was less evolved in also the history of the human body. Somebody who had not gotten off his 4 feet, 4 limbs, somebody who was still bending over, and I also feel like that also kind of links up with a certain sexual imagery also of someone who is bending over, because I also got the sense that the term queer is also being used for somebody who is passive, sexually passive, and not someone who is necessarily sexually active or is who occupies the penetrative role. So someone who is being penetrated, somebody who's being abused, somebody who's being shamed. Those kinds of
allowing himself to be penetrated.
Yes, exactly. So and that's probably true of many other Indian languages too. Of someone who I know in Tamil we have terms which mean someone who performs oral sex on somebody else. But as you say, where queer is being expressed or used more as a verb. Rather than a noun in many of our Indian kind of connotations, but also maybe in some of the English connotations too, where it's more of an act and not necessarily signifying of a subject or of a personhood. But we also know that many of the stages that you talked about queerness also overlap. There's a lot of overlapping going on. They're not these very clean, neat, distinct stages. So one of the things that actually I was just thinking about is this whole idea of, I think, something that you already kind of touched upon, which is the fact that it has a very masculine connotation. And so it'll be curious to know, how what kind of words or what kind of, like we also have a lot of code language going on, especially a lot of code words that gay men use with each other in these spaces. I think Alan Bray talks about it, where, you have code language, but then, what is the code language? How do you decipher it? How does it translate into normal, ordinary language is something that we don't really know. But what kind of, what kind of language is being used to express female intimacy, and how is it being expressed? And the other thing is also the fact that queer, is it purely is it purely a sexual category, or is it also being used to mean non-sexual intimacies? Was it ever used to express non-sexual intimacies? Intimacy, yes, non-sexual. Especially between people of the same sex. Again, the question of friendship. also becomes very important. I mean, how do we talk about friendship? And in fact, what I'm trying to ask you is how do we locate queer within a larger universe of terms being used to express sexual intimacy or even non-sexual intimacy, even at a time when queer wasn't necessarily being used to capture sexual intimacy or sexual acts, but probably there were other terms, other words that are being used to actually talk about, these kinds of intimacies, which may or may not be sexual.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I believe, for example, I was, because we started with the early modern period, let me think. I'm just reminded of an article, an essay rather, by Francis Bacon, Of Friendship, for example. And of friendship, if you see, it is only talking about male friendship and how you can, how friendship can be understood as noble. How can you make friendship more beautiful and all of that? And the assumption is friendship is always between men. Now, simultaneously, two other works. One is a prose comedy by John Lyly, Euphues, and Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, and other plays as well. But I would refer to these three. I'll connect these three. I'm sorry if you are not, if we have in the audience people who are not very familiar with English literature. I'm just drawing examples to make my point. It's like from Of Friendship. Second is, as I said, Euphues by John Lyly, and the third one is Merchant of Venice. Now, in all these three are like in a same category of talking about male friendship, where the love interest, the female love interest, is there by accident, as it were. Now, male friendship celebrated in Euphues or male friendship celebrated in Merchant of Venice are not censored. Every time, and this is the term I think which actually ruffled feathers the most, every time there was the possibility and a hint of quote unquote sodomy, the idea of sodomy, if that became apparent in any kind of male friendship, and I believe that became a problem. I don't think, very intimate male friendship, even Shakespeare's sonnets, for example, I mean, all of these, that did not threaten the structure of heterosexuality. In fact, if you had stronger male bonding, that meant that you are reinforcing patriarchy, so to speak. In fact, what Levi-Strauss says later, and also Gail Rubin in Traffic in Women, for example, in the 1980s. So the structuralist understanding of exchanging women as a conduit between men and keeping the male bonding alive in order to, keep patriarchy inviolable. So male friendship was not so much of a threat if there was no sodomy, because it was in any case strengthening patriarchy. So I believe a derogatory term would not, any other term, there need not be a different separate term for that. In fact, the entire colonial enterprise about which we talked about was kind of a masculine activity, and it could only succeed if there was a male bonding, right? So if that was looked upon as so positive, I believe there need not be another term to designate that male friendship, which was homosocial, maybe with hints of homosexuality. The moment you have hints of homosexuality, the problem arose particularly there, that when there is a hint of sodomy, people became afraid that, well, now this has to be censored, this has to be condemned. So I believe male friendship was always there, and it was not threatening anyone, but sodomy did. Yeah. Kiran, I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure why I was unmuted. Okay. So I was just saying that, again, I'm reminded of Alan Bray, where he talks about how certain forms of sexual behavior had to be codified in order to then, differentiate people from those who are apparently quote unquote queer. Because, so the thing is, it's the potentiality of certain forms of posturing, certain kinds of body language, which seem to pose a threat. Whether or not you're actually engaged in the act of sodomy, that may not matter. What is actually more material is the fact that you might be effeminate, whether or not you're actually, performing fellatio on a man, or involved in a same sex act, may be secondary. I think what really matters is the fact that you might be, with that lip wrist, or with that kind of high pitched voice, or certain forms of clothing. I mean, just the fact that sometimes there's no room to talk about, effeminate men who are not necessarily, queer, or not don't identify as queer, or don't necessarily perform
Yeah,
same sex.
there was this other word now, which was in vogue at that time, the word dandy. The dandy was
Yes.
not necessarily queer, but the dandy was that flamboyant, man who was supposedly feminine. So
Yes.
all to the 18th century and the 19th century. So dandy, it does have implications of queerness, but it was not necessarily queer. I believe that's one word. Dandy
Right.
could be one.
Yeah, and someone who's also an aesthete,
Yeah,
someone who has some aesthetic taste.
right. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, so yeah, I was just thinking about that, and I also, maybe if you can talk about, since you were going to talk about it, maybe how was it received in the Indian English, and especially in the field of Indian English literature, if you would like
What?
to.
Yeah, what queer?
Yeah, the word queer, and just the creation of a new queer culture, literary culture, perhaps. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think going back to the 1980s, maybe, that when we see an emergence of a designated queer literature, like it could be critical work, it was sometimes novels, poems, all of these were written. Um, Within the academia, I believe it took a long time to integrate it. I think it was not before the 2000s. We have too many examples of queer studies within the academia. But lots of work was being produced, and also I believe that book, Same Sex Love in India by Ruth Vanita and Selim Kidwai, that gave us a way of looking at our past queerly, if I can put it that way. We had a set of existing literature already, which were not read queerly so far. And I believe it gave us that kind of an insight, the queer insight which it lacked. Although I don't think in the book the term queer is used so much in same-sex love in India, but I think this queering literary history of India is happened with same-sex love in India. I think that would be a very interesting starting point. In fact, in Jadavpur University, you are aware that in 2005, when this course was introduced, one of the books which actually facilitated the introduction of this course at Jadavpur University was this book, Same Sex Love in India. And literary representations were all over the place, but at that time in the 80s, mostly it was mostly written by the diasporic uh, writers, not so much those who are located in India. And I don't think in the 80s and the 90s there was a separate category called queer literature, which we have now. There was no designated shelf for queer literature as such, like non-LGBT literature so much. But I believe, as I've said it somewhere else as well, that many feminist movements at that time were actually branching out to integrate the queer, and we have these very interesting histories of how like women activists have resisted the queer from being included into the feminine cultures. So all of that was happening all through the 80s and the 90s. And so I think emergence of a queer culture within the academia, within the literary field, and on the cultural scene, all of that can be attributed to three things: the expansion of the publication industry, the idea of a literary history which can be queered. Second and third is a kind of a bifurcation, or not a bifurcation, an expansion of the feminist movement. An expansion of the feminist movement to integrate the queer. But also, as we know, in 1999, we had the first Pride, the Friendship Walk in Kolkata. So that was kind of a political organizing that is taking over the streets, as queers read this, kind of instigate us to do. That didn't happen before 1999. So the 80s and the 90s, till about the 90s, that has not been very well documented. But I don't have the time here, but just to give you a reference, I'm just giving you a reference. I did a kind of a research starting from Delhi down to Kerala, where I interviewed academicians across India. And the last chapter of my book actually talks about this. Queer studies, text, context, praxis, the last chapter of the book. This is exactly where I've tried to historicize how queer studies or queer cultures emerged, because a certain kind of politics was emerging, and also at the same time, how literary and the cultural fields and also cinema, how all of that was facilitating the emergence of the political queer.
Thank you very much. Just one small observation before I turn to the audience, which is that I was also struck by the very ironic journeys that gay and Dalit have taken. In fact, because as you said, gay seems to be something which is being rejected, at least at some point in history, for something which is more neutral, certainly not happy. And while Dalit is also being questioned now by a lot of SC communities for being because they don't want to be seen as oppressed, so it seems to be like a strange kind of reversal. Okay, so let me just and one more thing, that it's also interesting that the queer community came up with the term straight as a slang, because why would you then want to call them straight, especially when you're being defined negatively against straight? So there might also be history of the kind of not so nice words that they made up for straight people. Of course, one of them being breeder, but then breeder also becomes a problem because there are lots of gay people who also aspire for families and parenting and child rearing. So breeder becomes a little bit of a ambiguous or counterproductive term, but yes, so it seems interesting.
It does.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just ask you some of the few questions that were from the audience. I'll just begin with I think the first question, which was going by the etymological history of the term, can the term queer be extended to incorporate a diverse range of marginalized positions, including the LGBTQIA? In other words, might there be a space for an intersectional alliance between queer and feminist, Dalit, and anti-racist politics?
I believe the emergence of the term queer coincided with racialization of sexuality identity politics in the US. So, of course, queer theory, queer studies as we know it today, it emerged because particularly feminists, were increasingly recognizing the importance of challenging white supremacy. They were being increasingly challenging white supremacy, and therefore race had to be included, certainly. So it was, it absolutely, inaugurated that moment of intersectionality. The emergence of queer race studies, and now if you can extend it to South Asia, of course, the idea of class, so to speak, in our case, class and caste, mostly ethnicity. Race, we call it race. In our case, it could be multiple ethnicities. Caste, class, all of that needs to be integrated within the understanding of queer. Just to explain this, for example, me, or maybe Kiran on the other side, we are comparatively more privileged as maybe queer people because we teach at a public university. We had the benefits of English education. We belonged, we have, and the benefits were facilitated because we were born within a certain family structure. Now, that is implicated in this whole idea of class and caste. So if I belong to the middle class or the upper middle class and I am from a Brahminical caste, then I am automatically given certain privileges which perhaps maybe a Dalit person had never had. So the way I am queer may not be the same way in which a Dalit person is queer. So the difference of queerness, the way you express queerness, but more importantly, the way you live with and by queerness depends, totally on where you are located in terms of class, caste, and of course, in case of India and other places also, whether you are come from a metropolitan center, whether you are coming from tier 1 city or a tier 2 city or a tier 3 city or from the rural area, wherever you belong. So all these intersectionalities have now become a part of queer discourses, and we are increasingly identifying that. Because without merging or understanding sexuality with respect to class, caste, ethnicity, and location, I don't think it is possible to get into the nuances of queer existence. So if today I have become, if I am lecturing you on queer because I come here with a set of privileges which have been given to me by a certain kind of upbringing, also at the same time, I may not be apologetic for my privileges because maybe I've earned some of them, but also at the same time, please remember that the fact that I can speak in English, that gives me so much power. Similar, I have a lot of friends from the rural community who can't speak English. And when I am communicating with them, I speak in a completely different language, a language which they will understand. Let me give one example. How many of us here, like, listening to this session, how many of you understand Ulti Bhasha? I don't think many of us understand Ulti Bhasha, the language which is in vogue within the Koti Hijra community in India for the longest period of time. But even when you call yourself queer, you know everything about the world. How many of you know Ulti Bhasha? How many of you know this? And Ulti Bhasha, as you see, Ulti is not alternative. Ulti means something, a language which is a coded language. Something which is upside down, a language which is upside down. Since we are talking about queer, its emergence in the language lexicon. Let me talk about Ulti Bhasha. How many of you know about that? I believe many of us don't. I can't speak Ulti Bhasha. I only know a few words. So that doesn't make me quintessentially Indian queer. It doesn't, because it does have a native indigenous history. If you know Ulti Bhasha. So intersectionality is absolutely important. And when I say gay, honestly speaking, those who speak Ulti Bhasha, they will not identify as gay at all. So intersectionality is absolutely necessary. I'm repeating, based on your class, based on your caste, based on the languages you can speak, and also your location. And also, if I can add to that, ability, disability. If you are an able-bodied person, of course, you are much more powerful than somebody who is disabled. So how many levels of intersectionality are we talking about? Economic, physical, cultural, all of that. So queer is now need to be, it's like multifarious facets to it. So we have to look at it there. So yeah.
The next question is, can the term queer be used in terms of performativity?
Of course, it did. I mean, in fact, Judith Butler was hugely facilitated by her performativity theory. Was hugely facilitated by the word, by how the word was kind of reclaimed and recuperated. As I just said, it doesn't really, signify any kind of identity category, and that's exactly what Judith Butler is talking about. That sexuality, gender is performative, sexuality is performative, and so at the end of the day, queer again opens up that infinite, indefinite space in which any kind of performance, the way performativity can be enacted. I'm just, it sounds weird, but that's how, but just to, keep in mind how Judith Butler used the term. So I believe, yes, queer, in my understanding, enables Judith Butler's theory of performativity. It did. I believe that's why I asked you towards the end of my lecture to read up that article, Critically Queer, which was published in 1993.
Okay, the next question is by Dr. Joydev Chakraborty. Can you say a few words about Sedgwick's idea of male homosexual panic?
Homosexual panic, to begin with, is not a term which was invented by Sedgwick. I'm sure you know that, but it actually came into the lexicon of psychology, if I'm not mistaken, in 1920 by someone called Edward Kempf. I have to check, but I think it's Edward Kempf. I'm not mistaken here. Edward Kempf. Edward Kempf, when he used the term homosexual panic, the way it was looked at, the way he defined it was that it's a perverse desire. So if a man who has so far perceived himself as heterosexual suddenly has the desire to sleep with another man, he panics because he thinks that is a perverse desire, and that is homosexual panic according to Kempf. Now, this term remained within the lexicon of psychiatry for a long time, but APA very recently, I think in the 1980s, maybe they kind of removed it from the list of diseases, of course. Eve Sedgwick expands this a little more. Eve Sedgwick says that homosexual panic is like, for example, I am a heterosexual man, and we were discussing friendship right now, a few minutes back. So I have a very intimate relationship with another man, and there is no sex involved in it. Let's not say sexuality. Let's not say that physical act of sex is not involved between me and my male friend, because I am heterosexual, he is also heterosexual, right? Now, because your intimacies are so deep that if you are mistaken as performing the act of sodomy between each one another, is a kind of homosexual panic from which these two heterosexual men will suffer. To put it in other words, homosexual panic is not a panic which homosexuals have. It is a panic which heterosexuals have when they perceive themselves as homosexual, or they think that people might consider them as homosexuals. I will give a real life example, and I believe many people will agree with me. In North India, I'm sorry, I'm generalizing the region, but just giving you an idea. For example, like in North India, mostly I've seen this happening very often, that male friendship, as I said, it's very, very palpable, and male friendship is very strong among very hyper-masculine men. And also these hyper-masculine men sleeping with comparatively femme boys is also very common. And they call them Mitha and all of that. And femme boys, it's just very common. But if you try calling them gay, if you tell them you are gay, if you say call them homosexuals, and they will like, no, we are not homosexuals, we are not gay, we are just doing this for fun. And there's a term for it which they call masti. They call it masti, and you cannot categorize them as a homosexual. Are Baba, you are having sex with a boy, but you refuse to be called homosexual. That is also a form of homosexual panic. Like, you do not want a label on you. You don't want a label on you, and there is a tremendous resistance towards that. I've seen that happening very, very, commonly. So I believe that is the homosexual panic which heterosexuals have. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is, could you say something about the Holocaust and homosexuals in Germany?
I would like you to read up. I have this entire chapter on this in my book. Weimar Republic. If you Google Weimar Republic, you would know. And the Weimar Republic is this very extremely liberal republic where homosexuality was, I wouldn't say rampant, but it was kind of rationalized, psychoanalyzed, and a very positive way. Weimar Republic is one of the most, I would say, very ideal sort of a model for understanding homosexuality. But by the end of the 1930s, 1938, 1939, when the Nazis emerged as a towering power in Germany, this the Weimar Republic liberalism towards understanding of homosexuality and the homosexual counterculture which existed there totally went under the carpet. I would, for example, writers, for example, W.H. Auden, Christopher Isherwood, Stephen Spender, and for example, E.M. Foster, many of them who used to visit Germany very often at that time, all of them actually fled from Europe with the Nazis coming into power. Again, for the Nazis, eliminating the homosexuals was important. I can go on and on with this, but let me not just one line that it's again, homosexuality was threatening the idea of perpetuation of a bloodline, and for any kind of something as militant as the Nazis, of course that was another sort of a masculine kind of performative act which happened within the Nazi camps and everything, the violence, the aggression, the oppression, all of that. but it was necessary to eliminate the homosexual because I believe it's not just it was threatening the heteropatriarchal structures, which thwarted any perpetuation of bloodline. But I think there was a tremendous fear among the Nazis because any kind of male bonding which happens during this kind of revolutions or any kind of oppressive structures within these male bondings, the possibility of sodomy, emerging as a possible sexual act is very high. So that's why homosexuals were to an extent eliminated. There are several other reasons. I am not going to go into that. There are entire books written on this, and since I'm talking about the etymology of the word queer, I don't think I can digress into that so much. But for a reference, you can look up my book where I have tried to summarize all of this in one single chapter. So if you wish to. Yeah.
Thank you. Then the next question again is from Shubhoshri, which is you have the question is that you have traced a trajectory of the word queer as it evolved over centuries. As it is an innately dynamic term, can you please comment on how it is still growing in meaning and scope?
Just last part of the question, I couldn't hear you.
As it is an innately dynamic term, can you please comment on how the term queer is growing in meaning and scope?
Oh, it is growing like anything in meaning and scope. And as I just said, that could be another lecture altogether. See, the point is, Wiley Blackwell in 2003 had a very interesting book called Queer Studies, an interdisciplinary reader. Now, I recommend this book to everyone to understand how queer as a term has expanded over the decades. Queer, I would say, as I said, is a non-category. It cannot be an identity category because it is a very expansive term. But queer, as I said, let me give you one example rather than, going into so many details of it. Let me give you a more heteronormative example. Queer is expanding in the sense something which challenges the normative, something which has been perceived to be the norm. Queer is a tool by which you can challenge that. One good example will be a heterosexually married couple, man and wife, right? So man and wife are married in a heterosexual structure. But for example, if that couple decides, remember the term, decides not to have a baby. If the couple also wants not to have a baby, it's like challenging the normative. In that sense, even within a heterosexual structure, a couple from within it can queer it. Am I making sense that a couple who decides not to have a baby can afford to queer the heteronormative structure by staying implicated within that structure? So queer has now become that expansive.
Okay, there's one more question, again by Chanchal De, which she asks, Vanita and Kidwai opt for the descriptive term same-sex love instead of queer. Can we use the term queer in Indo, as in I guess English literature, Indian literature in English freely, since the term and the theory itself are borrowed from the West?
So aren't you using Foucault? Aren't you using Marx? Aren't you using Judith Butler? So I believe all of us are using them. So what's the problem with the word queer? And certainly we can. And if you can invent a term which can be synonymous to queer, any indigenous term, I would be very happy to endorse that. Till then, let's use queer.
Okay, there's one more by Ronika Mukherjee, and she asks, can we say that even Londe-Bazi is just a form of pasty which involves internalized homophobia when brought into prominence?
not really homophobia. It's kind of a very indigenous culture, Londebas. It's a very, very indigenous culture. It was there forever. I mean, it cannot be traced back in history. How long? And Londebasi has also undergone so many transitions. I mean, Londebasi, as we understand it today, is certainly not how it was in the early 20th century. Nowadays, Londebasi has become, much more, as in we see in the Bhojpur area in Bihar mostly. That Londebasi is not something which used to exist in the 19th century and the 20th century. It was very different at that time. It was very, very different. Like it was not so much voluptuous. It was not so much sexual. It was about a man, wearing the clothes of a woman, and also, performing skits and little plays as a wife of a man. And those used to be very funny, and it was not, I think if you look, I think there's a very interesting documentary on YouTube. I can't remember the name of the person now, but I will check. She was a London dancer when she was younger, but I don't think she identifies as queer or gay or anything. But the kind of history she narrates, it's very different from what we understand as Sea of Londa today. It's very, very different. The history has undergone a huge transition. So earlier it was not so much homophobic. Nowadays, yeah, it may be, but I believe it's different in the sense that although a lot of violence, a lot of sexual violence is kind of part of Londa dancing and the way they are received by the audience, I think there is a deeper philosophy to it. I'm not going into it, but also the men have tremendous pleasure in penetrating boys because somewhere or the other, it sort of gives people, men, an idea of a lot of power. When you are penetrating a man rather than a woman, it sort of reiterates and reconfirms and reinstates your masculinity more than ever. So that kind of feeling is certainly there when there is so much desire for the Londa. So yes, it is about, establishing your hyper masculinity and showing the queer person as the receiving partner. So sodomizing him would give you that kind of masculine power. As Kiran was saying a little earlier, that, anybody who is passive, anybody who is at the receiving end, and if a man is kind of empowering or kind of, through an act of sex, with that person through a sexual act, that gives an immense power to the man somewhere or the other, and that kind of validates his masculinity, so to speak. That could be one way of looking at it. And of course, it would involve homophobia. Yeah.
And this is also in stark contrast to the Greek setting, where it was more of a pedagogical setting, a pedagogical relationship, where the younger man, once he becomes an elite citizen, isn't, is no longer, subservient or feminine or any of those things. Okay, participants, any other further questions that you'd like to ask? Please do ask now. Maybe you can raise your hand or you can type your question in the chat box. Although I'm pretty sure that we have already over-exercised Dr. Bakhshi's vocal cords. He's been speaking for nearly 2 hours now. So if you have any questions, then please make it brief. Any further questions? I think there was one question, but I couldn't quite follow it.
Okay.
Madhumita, if you want to clarify the question, you may. Maybe you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Madhumita?
Hello, yes. Actually,
Yes,
I
please
was
ask.
trying to, it was sent while I was typing. So, in fact, I had second thoughts regarding it. The resource person would have to go into launch into another session perhaps. Because I was asking about the queer, traces of the queer in fairy tales and children's fiction. So, I had only completed 2 lines of the sent by default, but that's it. That's what I was trying to ask.
I know. Can you just repeat the question? I think you weren't very clear.
Can you hear me now? Tracing the queer in fairy tales and children's.
Yes. So how do you trace the term queer in children's
fairy tales? Yeah. There has been a number of queer readings of fairy tales by now.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Grimm's tales, for example, they have been subject to queer reading since the late 1990s. Right. But what would interest you is that there is a whole range of I could say, manufactured queer folk tales very recently, which have come out from various parts of the world, where the model of the bestiary or the model of tales with a moral, all of those have been kind of, heterosexual characters have been replaced by, for example, gay penguins, bestiary, the form of the bestiary. So it's a new kind of literature which is emerging. I remember in 2014, I had a conference in the University of London, Birkbeck College, and we were having a conversation across the board on picturing the family. So my PhD thesis is on the family and sexuality. So we were having this conversation in Birkbeck, and there was this interesting conversation which came up where we were very fascinated to see that how family tales in the form of animal bestiaries, those that actually are now being cultivated and circulated to students. Like, you are providing them with characters which are queer, but it has the appearance of folk tales and fairy tales. So this is manufactured and cultivated queer folk tales and fairy tales, which is in vogue right now. And in fact, we are doing a project at Jadavpur University. It's called Bodies of Difference. And in Bodies of Difference, we visit various schools where we are trying to imbibe the idea of parallel sexualities and also disability by the way of, embracing people who are different. The idea of an inclusive classroom, so to speak. So in the idea of the inclusive classroom, we share with them these new little stories which are emerging, which are very easy to understand. But the assumption is not that parents would always be gay, or parents would always be heterosexual. There could be two mother penguins, or two mother cubs, or two father foxes, that kind of stories. So these are now quite famous in vogue. So one is like, you go back and reread those queer tales queerly, as queer theory has provided you with a political thinking tool, but also new stories are being manufactured at this time. You can look up and you see that these are all over various bookstores in Europe and the UK and also the US.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, then I'd like to join Anajori and the team and all the participants in thanking you, Kaustav, for coming today and for speaking so well and so meticulously in such an organized fashion. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. I'm very privileged to address you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Yeah.